So taking some of what I've already said and expanding, let's talk about how to actually make people care about your main character. Number one is, how can you give your protagonist more detail and depth? There are a few things that I like to do. One thing that I like to do is I always carry a notebook. Inside of this little book, I've got entire film ideas written out. I've done synopsis. There's pages that are just titles for potential films. Some of these are just lines of dialogue or something like that. And sometimes I'll even just make pages that are just small pieces of what could potentially be a story later. Like there's one here where I've written that some kind of bad guy also happens to have an obsession with Tupperware. I haven't yet been able to find the perfect situation to give a character this character trait, but nevertheless, I've got it. Because when you're out in the world, you never really know when an idea will strike you, and if you don't write it down, then you are more than likely to forget it 10 minutes later. I've yet to find an antagonist to give them an obsession with Tupperware. If I've got it in here, then someday I might just find the perfect fit. I cannot remember what it was that inspired that particular idea, but this little book is filled with all kinds of weird and wonderful things, to the point where if somebody else read it, they might be concerned for my mental health. Another way to flesh out traits for your protagonist is to look at some real-world examples. And one of the best real-world examples that you might have is yourself. If you are using your own personal traits as an example, it could get a little bit tricky because sometimes it involves digging a little bit deeper and finding out why it is that you do what you do. Are you socially awkward? Well, now your protagonist is too. Do you have an allergy to leather? So does your protagonist. Do you absolutely hate it when someone doesn't close a packet of chips and then they put it away into the pantry, and then the next time that you want to go and have some of those chips, they've gone stale and now you have no chips? Maybe you need to go and get some more chips. Or one of your characters keeps making the chips go stale, and you can use this to help create some conflict between them and another character. I'm always keeping an eye out for new ways that I can create conflict, because conflict is what makes things fun to watch. And if you can find details like this that are also relevant to your story, then you're on the right track. Making your story about your protagonist can be easy, but it can be also very hard depending on how complex your story actually is. As mentioned before, one of the main things that could be killing interest in your main character is that the story isn't specifically about them. A quick test you can do with this, as also mentioned before, is remove your main character, grab any other random character, and put them in that same position. Now that you have this new character, do all of the other events of the story happen exactly the same way? And if they do, then your story is not about your protagonist, and something needs to change. The story is not unique to your protagonist, and therefore they have no real impact on what is happening. One way to fix this is to remind yourself that the big bad problem of your story is actually about your protagonist. For example, if we look at the first Toy Story movie, the whole film is about friendship and working together, and yet the protagonist, Woody, is actually quite selfish in the beginning, and he wants to be the favorite toy. Then of course a new toy comes in and messes it all up, yada yada, and then by the end of that film, Woody learns to be selfless and help his new friend. Frodo is a representation of purity and innocence. And a lot of people will watch Lord of the Rings and comment on how Frodo is essentially no good at anything. He can't fight, he's not strong, there aren't really any scenes that tell us he is smart in any way, and he just never really shows any true skills of any kind. And I think that that is important for his character. He has lived a perfectly comfortable life. For those who might not have read the books, Frodo and Bilbo are actually filthy rich because of Bilbo's previous adventures. And they are actually the rich house that lives on the hill looking over everybody else. out of everyone who lives in the Shire, Frodo has probably lived the most comfortable life out of all of them. Traveling to Mordor and defeating Sauron would be nearly impossible for anyone, and yet somehow it would be even harder for someone who has absolutely no idea of how the world actually works. The Shire has offered Frodo a complete life of comfort. And so therefore, in a way, Frodo has even more reason to save it, because without it, he wouldn't have those comforts anymore. And then, of course, this changes by the end of the trilogy when Frodo comes home and realizing that it no longer feels like home at all. Another point is that hobbits are typically less susceptible to the ring's power. And number 3, as I mentioned earlier, is when the protagonist goes through the entire story without ever really making their own decisions. Maybe Frodo is guided and carried throughout a lot of situations throughout the film, but it's important to note it was his decision to volunteer himself to take the ring to Mordor. Remember that a passive protagonist is poison to the audience. Making someone passive may initially feel realistic because in real life there are a lot of people who, you know, they do live their lives in a passive way, but this doesn't necessarily work for film because we need someone to actually be driving the story. So maybe you have a character who is naturally quite passive, but throughout this story they need to actually make decisions, and then that shows us that they as a passive character are evolving. Another completely different example that comes to mind when I'm saying all of this is something like Mr. Magoo starring Leslie Nielsen. This may be one of those exceptions that I was talking about. Throughout the entire film, this character is kind of mindlessly wandering from place to place, while everything just kind of falls into place around him. So even if it's something that you should initially try to avoid, it doesn't actually mean that it's impossible. I'm really trying my best not to contradict myself in this video, but hopefully this video is still helping. And lastly, as I briefly mentioned before, the flaws in the character are the thing that make them interesting. The flaws and the weaknesses in your characters are what we are drawn to because we ourselves are flawed. So maybe your character is a superhero, but if you have one scene where your superhero is saving the world, and then the next scene where this superhero is stuck in line at the licensing center, then we are now able to relate to them in some way. So now, at least a little bit, this character is representing us as if we were in those same situations and facing those challenges throughout the entire film. Now that a small part of us is actually embedded in the story, we are actually learning more about how we would handle those situations that this character finds themselves in, whether they are good or bad. This is why one of my favorite parts in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is one of the post-credit scenes in the first Avengers movies where the whole gang is just sitting around eating shawarmas. So these guys have just saved all of New York City, but they get hungry too, they need food too, and it's just those small moments that actually help us relate to these characters. And you know what? I think I'm feeling pretty hungry now, and this video is getting a bit long, so I'm gonna go get something to eat.